So if there's one thing that has kept me sane in 2020, it's alcohol. But if there's another thing that's kept me sane in 2020, it is the Bond community. The Bond community are a bunch of James Bond fans who create amazing content about the James Bond movies and the James Bond books and the James Bond mythos. And I love it because I'm a complete Bond nerd, and so these people are all on my wavelength. I love consuming a lot of content because it's all really granular about specific areas that I find really interesting. But the thing is, I never feel like I can contribute much because I'm interested in all these different areas, but I'm not necessarily an expert on any of them. And so often, I'll consume this content and I'll think it's fantastic, but there's nothing really I can add to myself, except there are occasional exceptions. And it was weird. This new photo got released about the upcoming movie No Time to Die, which we've been waiting eagerly for since April. And immediately the Bond community jumped on it to pull apart and dissect all the different things and clues that you could see in the picture. So, there was Matt Spacey from Bond Suits, identified that it was a Tommy Bahama shirt, and then David Zaritsky from the Bond Experience spotted this little bit of a bottle that was Johnny Walker Black Label. I'm sure the Bond brain is probably going to go into the chessboard that's there. So, unless you go to the flooring of James Bond, which is a real Instagram account, by the way, and ask them about the hardwood flooring in this picture, which you can't actually even see, then I don't think there's much else for me to contribute, except then I saw books. Books I do know about. And yeah, there are books in that picture. And you can see the titles of them. And there's another picture taken from what we can presume is the same scene, where there are more books that are identifiable. And that got me thinking, whoa, I wonder what those books are. And I wonder what they mean to the upcoming movie. And I'm sure they mean something, because I don't think anything is ever added to a movie set just randomly. So it really got me thinking. These screenshots seem to come from what we presume is where James Bond lives in Jamaica once he's retired from the Secret Service and gone off to live on his own, because we think that Felix Leiter comes and lures him back into action. So this is where he's living, in Jamaica. The question is this his place, or is this a place that he borrowed from a friend or something like that? I reached out to talk about how granular the Bond community is. Bond Apartments, awesome guy called Luke, and we chatted about this, whether this is a rental property, whether it's a friend's property, whether he's hiding out somewhere, or whether this is his place. Because if it's his place, those books probably mean something. If it's not, then they probably don't. I'm going to go ahead and assume that where these scenes take place is actually James Bond's domicile in Jamaica. And then the next question is, okay, so is James Bond a reader? And we know for a fact he is, because if you look at the scene in Spectre where we see his apartment, there's not a lot in it. He's a very Spartan man, because he's travelling around all the time. There's a TV, a chair, a couch, but there are books. There are lots of books, actually. There are books stacked up everywhere. And we know for a fact that those books have significance, and have significance for Bond, because we actually got told that directly. So there was an article in the Sunday Times way back in 2015 that spoke to the guy who provided those books for that scene in Spectre. He's called Stephen Forster, and he runs a second-hand bookshop in Chiswick, which is not far from where James Bond's flat is. And he was approached by the makers of the James Bond movies to choose the books that appeared in M's flat when you saw her flat in Casino Royale, and Quantum of Solace, I guess, because in the Tarantula. And also, Stephen Forster provided the books that were in James Bond's flat in Spectre. And the Sunday Times actually had a list of some of them that I've kind of added to. So in Spectre, some of the books included The Traveller's Tree, A Journey Through the Caribbean Islands by Patrick Leigh Fermor. And that was included because James Bond, of course, has a link to the Caribbean. Ian Fleming lived in Jamaica. There have been a bunch of movies set in the Caribbean. Obviously, No Time to Die has this huge segment set in Jamaica and then in Cuba. There was John Arlott. There are books by John Arlott. They didn't actually have any specific titles. Ian Fleming went to school with John Arlott's uncle, which is potentially why he's included there, and he was actually mentioned in a couple of the James Bond books. If you don't know who John Arlott is, don't worry, I didn't either. I had to Wikipedia it. He was a cricket writer, so for 40 years he wrote books about cricket, which sounds like the worst type of reading ever, but James Bond did read books on golf, books on cards, so it makes sense that he might read books on cricket. There were some Philip Marlowe books around. Philip Marlowe is, of course, the private detective from Raymond Chandler books, and Ian Fleming specifically mentioning Goldfinger. James Bond bought the latest Raymond Chandler, so we know that James Bond read the Raymond Chandler books, so it makes sense that a Philip Marlowe book would be in there. Another writer who Stephen Forster included was Eric Ambler. Now, Eric Ambler, if you're not familiar with him, was actually a hugely influential spy writer, and in many ways he helped give birth to the whole espionage thriller genre almost in the same way that Ian Fleming did, and they were actually contemporaries. Eric Ambler is described as a dining companion to Ian Fleming, but we know for a fact that James Bond read Eric Ambler because it was in From Russia with Love, when he was flying to Istanbul, he was reading The Mask of Dimitrios, which was a romping spy thriller. There are also books included that were non-fiction on luxury watches and Aston Martin cars, which makes a lot of sense. There was a book called The Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides by James Boswell, and that is a book about a tour of the Hebrides in Scotland, which makes a lot of sense because James Bond is Scottish. Of course, in Skyfall you saw the estate that he grew up in Scotland, which is very, very, very grim and Scottish. So that, again, makes a lot of sense to include that. And there were also some books, the histories of some Scottish regiments. No specifics there, and that again makes sense. James Bond is a military man. Presumably he's interested in history, military history. The Scotland thing comes in again. So it's all the books that were included in Spectre were deliberate choices, and they made a lot of sense to James Bond as a character. So, moving on to No Time to Die, what books are included? Well, it's difficult, even with the high-resolution pictures, to identify all of the books, because I zoomed in. There was one that looked like the printing was actually in Chinese, I don't know. But there were 4 books specifically that I was able to identify. 2 from the most recent photo and 2 from an earlier photo. So I'll go to the most recent photos. The one that is most obvious, that you can actually read very clearly, is A Sailor's Tales. And there are a few books called A Sailor's Tales, but if you go to thrift books and stuff like that and look at the physical copies of the books you can buy, it's fairly obvious that this is A Sailor's Tales by Bill Robinson, which is a book published in 1978. Bill Robinson, if you are not familiar with him, because I bloody well wasn't, was the editor of Yachting magazine, and he was an avid sailor. And so this book, A Sailor's Tales, was basically a collection of his stories and experiences that spanned 50 years of yachting and sailing. So it was a book, let's see, I've got some sections here. A superb writer and teller of sea tales, Mr. Robinson muses wonderfully on events as varied as the early humiliations of a young boy with more passion for the sea than experience of handling it, to the peculiar problems of helping to operate Operation Sail. So yeah, there are tons of really interesting books about sailing and seafaring. And because James Bond was a commander in the Royal Navy, obviously he's got a deep attachment to the sea. That makes a lot of sense for him to have as a book sitting around. The other book that we can see there took me a little while to read the writing on it, is Sunset Song. Now, Sunset Song is a 1932 novel by a Scottish writer called Lewis Grassic Gibbon. I hadn't heard of the book or the writer, I have to admit, but in 2005 it was voted Scotland's favourite book, which is quite interesting. Makes a lot of sense that another book that has like a deep link to Scotland would be included there. What is the book about? Well, Sunset Song is the first book in a trilogy, but really this was the book that people loved, and the 2 other books weren't nearly as popular. It's set at the turn of the 20th century in Scotland, in the northeast of Scotland, Kincardineshire. And it's about this young woman called Chris who grows up on a farm. She has a big family, 5 brothers and sisters. Her father is a hard-working farmer. The mother is a very tired woman because she's given birth to so many children, and she's had miscarriages and things, and she finds out that she's pregnant again. So while Chris is still a young teenager, the mother kills herself and the 2 baby twins. Obviously that's devastating. The 2 youngest kids get sent off to live with relatives in Aberdeen, and Chris and her older brother Will are left on the farm with Dad, and it's hard, grueling work, and Will says, bugger this for a game of soldiers, hooks up with a girl called Molly and disappears off to Argentina, which a lot of Scots people did actually. Argentina has a surprisingly large percentage of people with red hair. So does Afghanistan. Anyway, I digress. So, Chris is left alone with her father, and her father has a stroke and becomes bedridden, so that makes her life even more miserable. And then the bedridden father passes at her and wants her to enter an incestuous relationship with her. I'm not making this stuff up. He eventually dies, and Chris is very sad. And then she meets this young farmer called Ewan, and they get married, and they have a baby, and everything seems perfect. And if I was a writer, I'd like kill the book right then. But no. Then her husband Ewan goes off to fight the First World War. He comes back a changed man. He's like abusive to her because of PTSD. Then he gets sent back once again to the front lines, and he is shot as a deserter. So yeah, that's a bundle of laughs, isn't it? And then at the very end of the book, she marries a minister, and that's where the book continues in the future. So, whew, yeah, it is a grim and depressing book. But then again, if you look at the portrayal of the Skyfall estate in Skyfall, the view of Scotland is pretty grim and depressing, even though it is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. So that makes a lot of sense to have that book included as well. Okay, the 2 other books that I identified were in the other picture, and these were quite tricky to get. One of them is The Complete Book of Sea Fishing. Now that's a fairly generic title, but again, if I researched it on thrift books and saw some of the physical copies of books with that title, it became fairly clear that this was the 1992 book by Alan Yates and Ted Entwistle. Alan Yates is a writer who's written another book on sea fishing in 1999. I mean, it's a book about sea fishing. There's not much more you can say about that. I'll say something, though. It does make a lot of sense, again, for that to be a book that James Bond might own, because he has a deep attachment to the West Indies, to the Caribbean. He loves the ocean. Marine biology and fishing actually features quite significantly in the James Bond books. So there's the scene in Live and Let Die where he's travelling underwater and sees the barracuda, gets attacked by the barracuda and stuff like that. There's the short story, The Hildebrand Rarity, which is about a rare type of fish. There's Oxpussy, about the octopus. So yeah, marine biology is quite a big thing in the James Bond books, so it makes sense that he might have a book like that sitting around his flat. The next book, though, is the one that I find really interesting. And this is possibly the book that gives the most clues to things that might happen in the movie. It is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and this is a book that was published in 1974. So it's a book that's like in a weird time frame. It's after Fleming's time, but it's before sort of the Daniel Craig James Bond's time. It's a very, very famous book. It's been described as the best-selling philosophy book of all time. And Christopher Lehman Haupt of the New York Times at the time, he wrote it as intellectual entertainment of the highest order. So what is it about? Well, it is a book by Robert M. Pirsig, and it is a fictionalized account of a real trip he took on a motorcycle from Minnesota to California with his son. In this book, the narrator, who you never actually learn the name of, goes on a similar trip, and he starts off with some friends, the Sutherlands, and the husband there, John, is used to sort of contrast against the narrator. So it's interesting to me. I like this particular book, and I like what it espouses, because the character of John Sutherland, he's a little bit vein, I would say, and he buys a swanky new motorcycle. This being the 70s, if you know anything about motorcycles in the 70s in the United States, you know it's not their best time. So he has a lot of frustration because his brand new bike is always going wrong and he has to go to mechanics and pay to get it fixed. Whereas our narrator has a much older bike and he fixes it himself, and he knows enough about motorcycle maintenance to be able to keep it running without having to pay for mechanics. More so than that, the book is kind of cool. I'm a bit of a car geek, so I kind of like this. It delves into how he looks at clues, like, you know, there's a lot of, the fuel formula is running rich because you can tell by the deposits on the exhaust, so he knows that because they're biking at higher altitude, he needs to adjust the mixture of gasoline to air, and it's a philosophical inquiry, kind of, I guess, about using clues and analysis to fix problems. And it resonated with me because I love old cars and I love tinkering with old cars, and if you look at some of my other videos, it's doing that. And there is a huge amount of satisfaction of just, you know, getting your hands dirty, figuring out what the problem is and fixing it. It always makes me feel like I've achieved something. So I love fixing old cars. I love fixing things around the house. I love cooking. I like brewing my own alcohol. I love all these things that you have to do and learn about the process. And I imagine that James Bond, especially Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond, would be that kind of person as well. And to a certain extent, it features in the books. I mean, the best example I can think of is James Bond's famous Bentley, which he manages to crash in most of the books. But you know, he maintains it, and it's, you know, it's got a special supercharger in it, which the Rolls-Royce company wash their hands of, and he's got a mechanic who keeps it maintained, and it's like his major hobby. So that makes sense that this book would be included from that side. But here's the thing that I think is a clue to what might happen in the movies, because the book is not just about motorcycle maintenance. In fact, the author points out that it doesn't really have much about Zen or practical advice about the art of motorcycle maintenance, which is quite an interesting intro to have. The book is told through the point of view of the narrator, but the narrator has an interesting past in which he had mental health issues that led to him having electroshock therapy that completely changed his personality. And the narrator, as we meet him, and especially in the beginning of the book, when we do all this interesting stuff about him analysing problems and repairing his motorcycle and his friend John having to pay mechanics to that, all of that is sort of the current personality of the narrator. But as the book progresses, his repressed personality begins to re-emerge. And this is like the super deep philosophical stuff, but I wonder whether that has any clues about the plot of the movie. And there's a lot of scope there to do that. You know, the movie opens with the trailers open with James Bond getting attacked and crashing into his apartment in Italy and saying the past isn't dead. It's like, oh, that's an interesting clue. Of course, Blofeld's in it, and Blofeld was portrayed in Spectre as like James Bond's pseudo brother, and there's the angst between them there. You wonder whether there are any clues from this whole story of the past re-emerging and the past personality re-emerging in the art of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. Whether those are clues to what might happen in the movie, I don't know. It could just be that the director was like, we've got blue walls, we need some purple in there, slap that copy of that book on there. But I think it's deeper than that. Anyway, those are the books that are featured in No Time to Die. Take that as you will. Finally, I can actually contribute something to the James Bond community. Yeah, if I see anything else like that in the future, I will let you know. Until next time, I will see you soon.